The air in the town of Redemption was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine from the high country and the bitter dust of the flatlands. Silas felt it scrape his lungs with every breath, a familiar punishment. He had come down from his mountain for salt, flour, and silence, but the town always gave him noise instead. It was the sound of wheels on hard-packed earth, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, and the low murmur of voices that judged him from behind shuttered windows. He was a ghost to them, a piece of the wilderness that sometimes drifted too close to their fragile civilization. He stood near the livery, his broad shoulders making a shadow that the midday sun could not erase. His gaze swept over the main street, a river of dust and humanity he had no desire to step into. Then he saw it. Down by the river crossing, where the spring thaw had turned the banks into a greedy, brown moor of mud, a scene unfolded that tightened a knot in his gut he thought had long since dissolved. A wagon, bearing the crisp, black lettering of the Union Pacific Railroad, was mired to its axles. A man in a tailored city coat, absurdly clean amidst the filth, stood on the drier ground, shouting. His voice was a whip. The target of his fury was a girl, no older than 16, struggling in the mudflat beside the wagon. She was trying to lever a rock under a sinking wheel, but with every desperate push, she sank deeper herself. The mud, thick and relentless, already had her to her knees. Silas's world narrowed to the sight of her. The pale braid of her hair had come undone, strands sticking to a cheek smeared with mud and tears. Her dress, a simple calico thing, was ruined, heavy with the clinging earth. But it was her eyes that caught him, wide with a terror that went far beyond the fear of drowning in mud. It was the terror of a trapped animal that knew the hunter was watching, enjoying the struggle. The man in the coat, Mr. Thornton, gestured impatiently with a leather-bound ledger. "Get on with it, girl." This delay is costing the company money. He made no move to help, his polished boots planted firmly on safe ground. He looked at her not as a person in peril, but as a malfunctioning piece of equipment. Silas felt a tremor in his hands. It was an old, hateful feeling he had buried years ago, shoveled over with dirt and stone and grief. He saw another face in the girl's, another pair of terrified eyes. Lily. His daughter. The memory was a physical blow, a ghost's fist to his stomach. The river had taken his family. He watched this river of mud try to take her, and something inside him, a lock rusted shut by years of solitude, broke with a silent, agonizing snap. He started moving. He did not run. His stride was long and deliberate, eating up the distance to the riverbank. The townspeople who had been watching from a safe distance fell silent. The mountain man was coming down. His face, bearded and weathered as a rock face, was a mask of cold fury. He did not look at Thornton. His eyes were fixed on the girl, who had stopped struggling, her energy spent. The mud now held her fast, creeping up her thighs. Thornton noticed his approach and straightened, his expression shifting from irritation to arrogance. "This is railroad business, friend. Move along." Silas ignored him. He walked past the man as if he were a stump and did not stop until his own boots met the sucking edge of the mire. He surveyed the situation for a single, practiced second. He saw the girl's exhaustion, the way the mud pulled, the precise angle needed. He took a discarded plank from the side of the track bed, one of a dozen left by the railroad crews. He laid it down, creating a stable path for himself. He moved with an economy of motion that was almost brutal in its efficiency. Reaching the girl, he did not offer a hand. He simply bent, slid one powerful arm under her knees and the other around her back, and lifted. There was a sickening, loud sucking sound as the mud released its claim on her. He pulled her free with a grunt of raw strength that spoke of a life spent wrestling with the unyielding forces of nature. He carried her back to solid ground and set her gently on her feet. She swayed, her thin frame trembling violently, covered head to toe in the cold, heavy muck. She couldn't meet his eyes, her gaze fixed on the ground as if expecting a blow. Thornton stepped forward, his face a mask of indignation. "Unhand that property. She is under contract to the railroad." He tapped the ledger again, a gesture of absolute authority. "It's all documented. She's part of a debt settlement. Her father's." Silas turned his head slowly to face the man. The look in his eyes was older than the mountains he called home. It was flat, cold, and utterly devoid of fear. He said nothing. He simply stood between the man and the girl, a silent, immovable wall of buckskin and muscle. He had seen men like Thornton before. Men who used paper and ink to do the work of a whip and chain. Men who saw human beings as figures in a column. Ilara, for that was her name, shivered behind him. She could feel the heat radiating from the big man's back. It was the first warmth she had felt in a very long time. For weeks, since her parents had succumbed to the fever, she had been nothing but an entry in Mr. Thornton's book. He had taken their farm, their wagon, their everything. And then he had taken her. He told her she was to work off the remaining debt in a laundry at one of the railroad's frontier camps, a place from which girls, she'd heard in whispers, did not return. She had been sinking, not just in the mud, but in a despair so deep it had no bottom. This stranger's sudden appearance was a shock, a rock thrown into the stagnant water of her misery. She didn't understand. No one had ever stood up for her. No one had ever looked at Mr. Thornton with anything but fear. I said, Thornton repeated, his voice rising, step aside. That girl is legally bound to me. I have the papers right here. He opened the ledger, as if the written words were a holy text that could smite the heathen before him. Silas finally spoke. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together deep underground. The girl is with me. The words were simple. A statement of fact. But they landed in the tense air with the weight of a final judgment. It was not a request. It was not a negotiation. It was a declaration of a new reality. Thornton's face flushed a dark red. He sputtered, a vein throbbing in his temple. With you? Who are you? You have no right, no claim. I am an agent of the Union Pacific Railroad. I represent the law here. The law, Silas repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked from Thornton's furious face to Ilara's trembling form. He saw the bruises on her wrist where the man had likely grabbed her. He saw the hollows in her cheeks. The law had done this. He had little use for that kind of law. Her debt is mine now, Silas stated. He had no money, not the kind Thornton would want. He had his strength, his cabin, and the ghosts that lived there with him. But in that moment, he knew he would trade all of it. He reached into the small leather pouch at his belt, pulling out the few coins he had. He threw them on the ground in front of Thornton's polished boots. They landed in the dust with a soft clink. That's a down payment, Silas said, his voice flat. The rest will be settled. Thornton stared at the paltry sum, then laughed, a harsh, grating sound. That's absurd. That wouldn't buy her shoes. Her father's debt is over $500. You are a fool. He looked around, appealing to the small crowd of onlookers that had gathered. This vagrant is interfering with company business. Sheriff ought to lock him up. But the sheriff was conveniently absent, and the townspeople just watched, their faces a mixture of fear and a strange, budding fascination. No one had ever defied a railroad man so openly. Silas did not flinch. He simply held the man's gaze. Then the debt is $500. I will pay it. He had no idea how, but the words were out, and they had taken root in the earth. He would find a way. He would tear the gold from the mountains with his bare hands if he had to. He turned his back on Thornton, a gesture of supreme dismissal. He looked down at Ilara. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were wide and searching. He saw fear in them, but also a flicker of something else. A question. Hope, perhaps. It was a fragile thing, and he felt an overwhelming, terrifying urge to protect it. He shrugged off his heavy outer coat, the worn disc-in smelling of wood smoke and pine. He draped it over her shivering shoulders. It was huge on her, swallowing her small frame, but it was warm and dry. Come, he said, his voice softer than she would have thought possible. He started walking, not toward the town, but away from it, toward the steep trail that led up into the jagged peaks that clawed at the sky. He did not look back to see if she was following. He knew she would. Behind them, Thornton's voice rose to a furious shriek, promising lawsuits, marshals, and ruin. Silas did not hear him. He was listening to the sound of small, hesitant footsteps squelching in the mud behind him, and the frantic, unfamiliar beating of his own heart. The journey up the mountain was a silent one. Ilara followed in the man's enormous footsteps, the heavy coat a comforting weight on her shoulders. The path was steep and unforgiving, a twisting ribbon of stone and dirt that seemed to lead to the top of the world. Her legs ached, her lungs burned in the thin air, but she did not complain. The man, Silas, moved with a tireless, fluid grace, as much a part of the mountain as the ancient pines and weathered granite. He stopped only once, beside a stream of snowmelt so clear it looked like liquid glass. He took a tin cup from his satchel, filled it, and offered it to her. Her hands were still caked in drying mud, shaking as she took it. She drank greedily, the icy water a shock that seemed to wash away some of the fear. He said nothing, simply waiting with a patience that felt as old as the rocks around them. From her new vantage point, she saw the town of Redemption shrink below, becoming a child's collection of wooden blocks. Mr. Thornton's wagon was a black speck. The world that had been her prison for weeks was now just a smudge in the distance. Up here, the air was different. Cleaner. The silence was not empty, but filled with the whisper of wind through the trees and the cry of a lone hawk circling high above. Silas watched her from the corner of his eye. He saw the way she clutched the coat around her, the way she flinched at the snap of a twig. She was a bird with a broken wing, ready to bolt at the slightest threat. He felt a clumsy, unfamiliar tenderness that sat uneasily in his chest. He was used to solitude. For 5 years, the only voices he heard were the ones in his memory. This girl's presence was a disruption, a sharp note in the long, low hum of his grief. He remembered leading his own daughter, Lily, up this same path. Her small hand in his, her laughter echoing off the canyon walls. The memory was so vivid it made him stumble. He caught himself, his jaw tight. He could not afford to remember. Not now. He had to focus on the living, not the dead. Finally, as the sun began to dip behind the western peaks, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, they came to a small clearing. Nestled amongst a stand of aspen trees was a cabin. It was not large, built of sturdy, hand-hewn logs, with a stone chimney from which a thin curl of smoke was already rising. It looked as if it had grown from the mountain itself. This was his sanctuary, his fortress of solitude. No one had set foot in it since Sarah and Lily, since the flood. Bringing this girl here felt like a violation, a betrayal of their memory. But leaving her to Thornton had not been an option. It was not even a choice. It was a compulsion, as instinctual as breathing. He pushed the heavy wooden door open. The inside was sparse and clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a crackling fire already blazing within, set that morning before he left. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. A bed, neatly made with wool blankets, was tucked into a corner. On a small shelf above it sat a single, carved wooden horse, its paint faded from the touch of a small hand. Ilara stepped inside, her eyes taking in everything. She had expected a rough, dirty hovel. This was a home. It was quiet and sad, but it was a home. She saw the little horse on the shelf and felt a pang of kinship. She instinctively touched the pocket of her dress, where the small wooden bird her own father had carved for her was hidden. Silas gestured toward the fire. "Get warm. There's a pump outside for water." Clean up, his words were commands, but his tone was not unkind. He pointed to a small crate near the hearth. "There are clothes in there. They were they will fit you well enough." He turned away then, busying himself with unpacking the supplies he had bought, giving her privacy. He could not bring himself to say the word wife. The name Sarah was a holy thing, a name he only spoke to the wind and the stars. The clothes were hers. He had never been able to part with them. Now, the thought of this girl wearing them sent a strange mix of pain and something else through him. It felt right, somehow. As if a house that had been holding its breath for 5 years had finally been allowed to exhale. Ilara found a basin and hesitantly went outside to the pump. The cold water was a balm, washing away the mud and the last traces of Mr. Thornton's presence. Back inside, she pulled the clothes from the crate. A simple wool skirt and a soft linen blouse. They were worn but mended with neat, careful stitches. They smelled faintly of dried lavender. As she changed, she felt as though she were shedding an old skin, washing away the girl who was property and becoming someone else. Someone new. When she emerged from behind a blanket he had hung for her, Silas was stirring a pot over the fire. He glanced up, and for a fleeting moment, his composure cracked. In the firelight, wearing his wife's clothes, her damp hair hanging loose around her shoulders, she looked so much like. He turned back to the pot, his knuckles white as he gripped the spoon. He served the stew in silence. It was simple fare, venison and root vegetables, but to Ilara, who had been living on hardtack and stale bread for weeks, it was the finest meal she had ever eaten. They ate at the small table, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the scrape of spoons against wooden bowls. The silence was not awkward. It was a space for healing. After they ate, Ilara felt a wave of exhaustion so profound it was a physical weight. She looked toward the bed, then back at the hard floor. She would not presume. Silas seemed to read her mind. "You take the bed," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He took a spare blanket and settled himself in the chair by the fire, his long frame looking impossibly uncomfortable. He would stand watch. He had failed to protect his family once. He would not fail again. Ilara climbed into the bed, the wool blankets rough but warm. The mattress was filled with soft pine needles, and the scent was soothing. From this angle, she could see the carved horse on the shelf more clearly. She saw the initials LA burned into its base. Lily. She finally understood. This place was not just a home, it was a shrine. This man's heart was not empty, it was full of ghosts. She was a stranger intruding on his sacred grief. And yet, he had brought her here. He had saved her. She clutched the wooden bird in her pocket and, for the first time in months, she did not cry herself to sleep. She felt safe. 3 days passed in a quiet, rhythmic pattern. Silas would rise before dawn, his movements quiet and sure in the dim light. He would tend the fire, then disappear into the forest, returning hours later with game or firewood. Ilara would wake to the warmth of the cabin, find food left for her on the table, and spend the day exploring the small clearing, never straying far. She swept the floors, washed their bowls, and mended a tear in his coat with the neat stitches her mother had taught her. They were small acts, offerings of gratitude she could not yet speak aloud. They barely spoke, but a silent language grew between them. A nod of thanks from him when he saw the mended coat. A small, hesitant smile from her when he left a handful of wild berries on the table. Trust was being built, not with words, but with deeds. He was learning the shape of her fear, and she was learning the contours of his sorrow. One afternoon, she was sitting on the cabin steps, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick, when he came and sat near her. He was carving a piece of wood with a small, sharp knife, his large hands surprisingly deft. She watched the wood shavings fall to the ground. "He'll come back," she said, her voice a near whisper. It was the first time either of them had acknowledged the threat that hung over them. Silas did not look up from his carving. "I know. He has papers," she insisted, the word like a curse. "He says the law is on his side." "Paper burns," Silas said simply. He held up what he was carving. It was a bird, a hawk with its wings outstretched, its details rendered with astonishing skill. He had seen the small bird she clutched through the fabric of her pocket. It was his way of saying, "I see you." Her breath hitched. She pulled her own small, simple bird from her pocket. "My father made this for me." He took it, his calloused fingers gentle as they traced the worn wood. He looked at it for a long time, then looked back at the horse on the shelf inside. "A good man," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not hide. He handed the carving back to her and stood up abruptly, retreating into the fortress of his silence. But the wall between them had cracked. He had shared a piece of his grief, and she had shared a piece of hers. The piece was shattered on the 5th day. The sharp, angry sound of a horse being ridden too hard up the mountain trail reached them first. Silas was instantly on his feet, grabbing his rifle from its pegs by the door. He motioned for Ilara to get inside. His face was grim, his eyes cold steel. The time for quiet was over. Mr. Thornton appeared at the edge of the clearing, his fine coat snagged and his face purple with exertion and rage. He was not alone. The town sheriff, a man named Gable whose spine seemed to be made of jelly, was with him, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Silas!" Gable called out, his voice strained. "You need to come out. Mr. Thornton has a federal writ." Thornton dismounted, shoving a thick sheaf of papers forward. "This is a warrant for the seizure of company property, namely one Ilara Vance. And an arrest warrant for you, for theft and obstruction." He smiled, a triumphant, ugly twisting of his lips. "Your little game is over, Mountain Man. You have 24 hours to turn her over, or Sheriff Gable here will be forced to form a posse and take you by force." Sheriff Gable looked at the ground, unable to meet Silas's gaze. "It's the law, Silas. My hands are tied. The railroad, they have powerful friends." Silas stood in the doorway of his cabin, the rifle held loosely at his side. He was not aiming it, but its presence was a clear statement. He looked past the two men, his gaze fixed on the valley below. He could not win a fight against a posse. He could not hide on this mountain forever. Thornton had brought the fight to him, armed with the full, crushing weight of a corrupt law. "One day," Silas said, his voice deceptively calm. "Then you can come back." Thornton sneered. "Enjoy your last day of freedom." He turned his horse and rode away, leaving the sheriff to retreat with a final, apologetic glance. When they were gone, Silas lowered the rifle. The calm on his face was gone, replaced by a deep, troubled look. He had bought them time, but not nearly enough. He knew he could not solve this with strength alone. He needed something else. He needed an ally. He needed the truth. He turned to Ilara, who was watching him from the shadows of the cabin, her face pale with renewed fear. "Stay inside. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." He grabbed a satchel, stuffing it with a loaf of bread and a water skin. "I'm going back to town." He was going to see Martha. Martha Gable, the sheriff's mother and the town's retired midwife. She was the only person in Redemption who remembered his wife, Sarah, with kindness. She was the only one who had ever looked at him without fear or pity. Her mind was as sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, and her heart was as solid as the mountain itself. If anyone in that town had the courage to help him, it was her. He was gambling their future on the hope that she had not changed. Silas moved through the twilight forest like a spirit, his long stride silent and sure. He reached the edge of town as the last lights were being extinguished. He did not go down the main street. He slipped through alleys and back lots, a shadow moving among shadows, until he reached the small, neat house at the end of town where Martha lived. A single lamp still burned in her front window, a beacon in the oppressive dark. He knocked softly. The door opened a crack, and Martha's sharp, intelligent eyes peered out. She was a small woman, made smaller by age, but her posture was ramrod straight. She saw who it was, and her eyes widened, not with fear but with a deep, knowing sorrow. "Silas," she breathed. "I had a feeling you would come. Get in, quickly." Inside, her home was filled with the scent of drying herbs and old books. She led him to the kitchen, where a kettle was already steaming on the stove. She said nothing as she poured 2 cups of strong tea, her movements calm and deliberate. She had seen him in town that day, had heard the whispers about the girl and the railroad man. "It's about the child, isn't it?" she said, her voice gentle but firm. Silas nodded, his throat tight. It was hard to find the words. He was not a man used to asking for help. He told her everything, his voice a low, gravelly monotone, but she heard the fierce, protective desperation beneath it. He told her about Ilara, about Thornton, about the debt and the legal papers that felt like a death sentence. Martha listened without interruption, her gaze never leaving his face. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment, her fingers steepled under her chin. "My son is a good man, but a weak one," she said sadly. "He fears the railroad more than he fears his own conscience. Thornton has the town in his pocket. People are in debt to him. He arranged for supplies on credit, extended loans for land, then when the crops failed or the work dried up, he collected. He's a predator," Silas growled. "He's worse," Martha corrected. "He's a bookkeeper. He turns people's lives into numbers on a page, and he is very, very good at making those numbers work in his favor. Ilara's parents were good people. They took a loan from the railroad to pay for their passage and file their land claim. They were never given a chance to succeed. Thornton saw to it." Silas slammed a fist on the table, making the teacups rattle. "There has to be a way. Some proof." Martha's eyes glinted in the lamplight. "Perhaps there is. Thornton is arrogant. He keeps meticulous records of his business. He brags about his efficiency. He carries that ledger with him everywhere." An idea, dangerous and desperate, began to form in Silas's mind. "The ledger? It's his weapon," Martha finished for him. "And it might just be his undoing. If we could see what's in it, I suspect we would find more than just Ilara's debt. We would find a pattern of fraud. Usurious interest rates, falsified charges, land claims illegally seized." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He stays at the boarding house. He leaves his room every night at 9 o'clock to go to the saloon. He likes to drink and play cards with the men he is slowly ruining. The plan was insane. It was theft. It was a crime. But the law had already failed them. Sometimes, to find justice, you had to step outside the law." Silas met her gaze, and in her steady, determined eyes, he found the confirmation he needed. He was no longer alone in this fight. While Silas was forging an alliance in town, Ilara was facing her own battle in the cabin. The silence, once a comfort, was now a torment. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside, sent a jolt of fear through her. She had barred the door as he'd instructed, and she sat huddled in the chair by the dying fire, clutching the poker, her heart hammering against her ribs. She thought about her parents, about the way Mr. Thornton had spoken to them, with a voice full of false sympathy as he piled on fees and charges they could not understand, let alone pay. He had been so polite as he stripped them of everything they owned. Her father, a proud, strong man, had been reduced to a broken shell before the fever took him. She would not let that happen to Silas. This man, this stranger, had shown her more kindness in 5 days than she had known in the last year. He had reawakened a part of her she thought was dead, her will to fight. She would not be a passive victim, a piece of property to be reclaimed. When Silas returned, she would stand with him. She didn't know how, but she would find a way. Her voice was small, but it was hers. And she would use it. Silas moved through the sleeping town like a ghost. Under the cover of a moonless sky, he slipped into the boarding house through a window Martha had told him was always left unlocked. He moved up the stairs, his moccasins making no sound on the creaking wood. He found Thornton's room and, using the thin, sharp blade of his skinning knife, gently worked the simple lock until it clicked open. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke and expensive cologne. A quick search revealed the ledger, sitting right on the nightstand, as if Thornton were too proud to even hide it. Silas grabbed it, his heart pounding a heavy rhythm against his ribs. He was halfway out the window when he heard footsteps in the hall. He froze, melting back into the shadows of the room. The door opened. Thornton entered, earlier than expected, humming a tuneless melody. Silas held his breath, pressed flat against the wall behind the door. He could feel the cold leather of the ledger against his chest. Any sound, any mistake, and it would all be over. Thornton crossed to the wash basin, oblivious, and began to splash water on his face. It was the only chance he would get. As silent as a hunting cat, Silas slipped back out the window and dropped lightly to the ground below, disappearing into the night. Back at Martha's house, they spread the ledger open on the kitchen table. The lamplight fell on page after page of neat, precise columns of numbers and names. It was exactly as Martha had suspected. It was a meticulous record of systematic exploitation. Names of dozens of families were listed, each with inflated debts, impossible interest rates, and notes in the margins detailing how their assets were to be seized. He had been bleeding the entire settlement dry. "Look here," Martha said, her finger tracing a line. "Ilara's family. The original loan was $100. His added charges for transportation inconvenience, clerical fees, late payment penalties. His manufactured a debt of over $500 from nothing." She looked up at Silas, her eyes blazing with righteous fury. "This is the proof. This is the weapon." The next morning, Silas did not go back to the mountain. Instead, he and Martha went to work. They started with the blacksmith, a burly man named Thomas whose brother had lost his farm to the railroad a year ago. Silas said nothing. He simply opened the ledger to the page with Thomas's brother's name. The blacksmith stared at the numbers, his face turning from confusion to rage. "That thief," Thomas growled, his hands clenching into fists that could shatter rock. "He told my brother he was lucky the company didn't press charges for defaulting." They went next to the mercantile owner, a woman who had been forced to sign over a portion of her business to cover a supply debt that had mysteriously tripled. They showed her the ledger. They showed it to the farmer whose water rights had been bought for a pittance under threat of foreclosure. Page by page, person by person, they revealed the truth that Thornton had hidden in plain sight. The town's suspicion of Silas began to melt away, replaced by a slow-burning, collective anger. He was no longer the strange hermit from the mountains. He was the one who had dared to pull back the curtain and expose the rot beneath their lives. People who had once crossed the street to avoid him now met his eyes with a nod of respect, a silent promise of support. When Silas finally returned to the cabin late that afternoon, he found Ilara waiting on the steps. She had not slept. But the fear in her eyes was gone, replaced by a resolute calm. She saw the ledger under his arm and the new expression on his face. "You found it," she said. "We found it," he corrected. "And now, we end it." He sat beside her, the weariness of the last 24 hours settling deep into his bones. He felt a profound sense of peace. He had spent 5 years running from the world, hiding from the pain of human connection. Now, he was about to stand before the entire town and fight for it. For her. "I am frightened," Ilara confessed, her voice small. Silas looked at her. He saw her strength, the resilience that had allowed her to survive. He thought of his own daughter, of the future that had been stolen from her. He could not get that back. But he could build a new one. "Courage is not the absence of fear," he said, the words coming from a place he did not know he still had. "It is acting in spite of it." He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently placed it on her shoulder. It was the first time he had touched her since he pulled her from the mud. It was a promise. A pledge. "You are not alone." The deadline arrived with the high sun of noon. Thornton and Sheriff Gable rode into the clearing, but this time, they were not alone. Behind them, a group of half a dozen men, hastily deputized, sat on their horses, looking grim and uncomfortable. The posse. But something was different. From the woods surrounding the cabin, people began to emerge. The blacksmith, Thomas, carrying his heavy riveting hammer. The mercantile owner. The farmers. Dozens of them, men and women, standing silently, their faces hard and unyielding. They formed a ring around the clearing, a human wall between Thornton and the cabin. Thornton's confident sneer faltered. He looked at the silent crowd, then back at the sheriff. "Gable. What is the meaning of this? Disperse these people." Sheriff Gable looked at the faces of his neighbors, at Martha, his own mother, standing in the front rank, her expression one of cold disappointment. He looked at Silas, standing on his porch with the girl beside him. He finally straightened his shoulders, a man making a choice. "I don't believe I will, Mr. Thornton. It seems the town has some questions for you. This is an outrage. An illegal assembly." Thornton shrieked, his composure shattering. "I have the law on my side." "Let's talk about the law," a new voice said. Martha stepped forward, her small frame radiating an authority that dwarfed Thornton's. "We believe your ledger might be of interest to a federal judge. The one you keep such meticulous records in." Thornton's face went white. He instinctively reached for the satchel on his horse where he usually kept the book. It was not there. His eyes darted to Silas, who now held the ledger up for all to see. "You!" Thornton choked out, his face a contortion of fury. "Thief!" "He's not the only thief here today," Thomas the blacksmith boomed, his voice echoing through the clearing. "My brother's farm. Tell us how that debt doubled in a month, Thornton." Another voice shouted, "My water rights." And another, "My store." The accusations came like a volley of arrows, one after another, pinning Thornton where he stood. The men in his posse began to shift uneasily, some turning their horses to sidle away, wanting no part of this. Thornton, cornered and exposed, made his last, desperate play. He pointed a trembling finger at Ilara. "This is all a distraction. That girl is bonded property. The writ is legal. Her signature is on the contract." All eyes turned to Ilara. She stood beside Silas, her small frame trembling, but her head was held high. This was her moment. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but it carried with absolute clarity in the sudden silence. "He came to our farm after my parents died," she began, her gaze fixed on Thornton. "He brought papers. He said we owed money we did not have. He said I had to work it off or he would have us thrown in jail for defaulting. My father, sick with grief and fever, signed. I did not. He said my father's signature bound me. He said I had no choice." She took a step forward, away from the protective shadow of Silas. She was standing on her own. "He told me I was nothing but a name in his book. An asset to be collected." She looked out at the faces of the townspeople. "My name is Ilara Vance. I am not a number. And I am not his property." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Her simple, powerful testimony had done more damage than any legal argument. She had reclaimed her name, her identity. Silas stepped forward, holding the ledger. "This book tells the real story," he said, his voice a low growl of thunder. "It's a record of his crimes against every one of you. The choice is yours. Do you believe his paper, or do you believe your own eyes?" The decision was made in an instant. It was not a vote, but a tide. The crowd surged forward, not with violence, but with an immense, inexorable pressure. They surrounded Thornton, their silent condemnation more terrifying than any threat. Sheriff Gable finally found his courage. He dismounted, walked up to Thornton, and took the federal writ from his hand. He tore it in half. "Your authority is not recognized here, Mr. Thornton," he said, his voice steady for the first time. "My advice to you is to get on your horse and ride. And do not ever come back to Redemption." Thornton, his face pale and slack with defeat, stared at the wall of hostile faces. There was nothing more to say. His power, built on paper and fear, had vanished. He scrambled onto his horse and galloped away, not looking back, the jeers of the townspeople following him down the mountain. A quiet cheer went up from the crowd. People were smiling, clapping each other on the back. They had faced down the dragon and won. Martha came forward and embraced Ilara, who was now weeping, not with fear but with overwhelming relief. Silas stood on the porch, watching. He felt a profound sense of belonging he had not known for 5 long years. These people, who had once been strangers, were now his allies. They had stood with him. He had become part of a community again. As the crowd began to disperse, making their way back down the mountain with lighter steps, Martha approached him. "You did a good thing today, Silas. You reminded this town what it stands for. She looked at Ilara, who was now smiling through her tears. And you have a daughter again. The word hung in the air. Daughter. It did not sting as he thought it would. It felt right. He looked at Ilara, not as a ghost of his past, but as the promise of a future. Later that evening, the cabin was quiet again. Ilara sat at the table, carefully mending one of her old dresses. Silas sat by the fire, carving. The silence was comfortable, filled with an unspoken understanding. This is your home now, Silas said, not looking up from his work. If you want it to be. Ilara stopped sewing. She looked around the small, warm room. At the stone hearth, the sturdy table, the bed where she had finally found peaceful sleep. At the quiet, powerful man who had saved her in more ways than one. It was more of a home than any place she had ever known. I would like that, she said, her voice soft but sure. I would like that very much. He finished his carving and held it out to her. It was a new piece for the shelf. It was not a horse, and it was not a hawk. It was two figures, standing side by side, looking out at the mountains. One was a large man, the other a young girl. A family. She took it, her fingers tracing the smooth wood. She placed it on the shelf, right next to the little horse. They belonged there, together. The ghosts of the past were still there, but they were no longer alone. A new family had been born, not of blood, but of choice, forged in the crucible of courage and kindness. High on the mountain, in a small cabin built of resilience and love, a man who had lost everything and a girl who had nothing found that, together, they had all they would ever need.